We've been riding this bike for many months now, and we've had a lot of people ask if we like it better than the last gen, should they replace their bike, and where does it stand against other competitors in the field. We got some good bits of information. I think you're gonna enjoy it. Goods, bads, and indifferent. So stay tuned and let's get into the Norco Sight. So, much to the dismay and excitement of probably all mountain bikers out there, depending on which side of the camp you sit, Norco has moved their high pivot suspension platform into shorter and shorter travel bikes. Even the Optic now has a high pivot suspension platform. This here is the Sight, which is a 160, 150 bike. And I would say that the Sight kind of sat almost as like a 50-50 bike, maybe 60-40 probably is a little closer to uphill, downhill, biases. And we think that there was probably a lot of more pedal or trail oriented riders that might have been a little disappointed to see what is perceived to be a lack of pedaling efficiency, climbing agility, and performance. Conversely, I think there was a lot of riders that are more downhill focuses, like us, that were pretty excited and curious to see what this modification or modernization, I should say, of the Norco Sight was going to ride like. So before we head out to the trail for some POV and action footage reviewing this bike, I'm going to talk a little bit about the geometry, some of the notes we had, and of course price points and models available. Getting into some of the models here, Norco has a carbon and aluminum option for these bikes. There's a carbon frame set as well as an aluminum frame set. And prices go anywhere from $39.99 up to $74.99, depending on the model for complete bikes. The frames go for $23.99 for the alloy or $39.99 for the carbon frame. Sizing is something that we struggled a little bit with. Norco has gone with the size number 1 through 5 structure rather than small, medium, large. And we kind of sit right between the 3 and the 4. And I think it's just happening more and more these days as brands from different regions are designing and building bikes to perform differently for the types of trails they most commonly find themselves on. We'll get a little bit to what that meant for us later, but we did ride a size 4, which has a 497.5 millimeter reach. The rest of the geo on the bike is pretty awesome, I'd say, for the intended application and purpose of the bike. 64-degree head tube angle, 77.75 seat tube angle. The chainstays are at 438 and grow, so that's a number that you might want to check out. Stack height is 645. So the size 4 has a reach of 497.5, as I said, whereas the size 3 has a reach of 472.5. So that's quite a big difference. Moving into the complete bike, right? We're big believers that not just one dimension makes or breaks a bike. The entire wheelbase of the bike is 1253 versus 1286 static, right? At sag, high pivot bikes, rearward axle path, that means this thing is getting millimeters longer. So you've already got a 33 millimeter increase in wheel length static. So then when you talk about being into the compression or the suspension travel, that's probably, I mean, it's gonna stay relative the same, but that's gonna make that bike even longer than 1286. Our bike comes in with a 35.4 pound weight, and now we're gonna get into some of the ride impressions. All right, so climbing, traction is absolutely phenomenal, as one would expect, right? The ground tracing capabilities of the rear tire, like going over these types of rocks, roots, all really good. Also makes for a comfortable, like plush climbing experience. The downside is, as with anything, a little bit more effort and energy required. I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker, but you know, if you were kind of more the sporty climb trail XC biased sight lover before, could be a deterrent, a little bit of a downside. But for the trail rider who just gets to the top but is willing to make that sacrifice, on some efficiency for the improved suppleness and sensitivity and traction and comfort. It's a pretty worthwhile trade-off, you know, as more of a gravity biased rider myself, but I could definitely see XC riders being a little bummed about it. Braking, oh yeah, the braking suspension is still surprisingly active and smooth, so when you're on the brakes, back end still remains pretty active, pretty soft. The length of the bike is an issue for me for sure. Yeah, buddy, nice work. This big 500 millimeter reach. Sadly, we just got a bike that was a size bigger than we wanted. I'm 5'11", and I know some people are gonna say we need to trust engineers more because they know what's best for us, but it's just not true. Like, an engineer can't design one bike that's, you know, gonna work for everybody everywhere. And as you can see here, the trails are narrow. We're on the side of a hill, and if you've ever seen, you know, a semi-truck try to drive up tight switchbacks on a mountain pass, you'll know they need a lot more road to make the turns. And the same is true with a mountain bike. So a long wheelbase and a long reach isn't great for this kind of backcountry explorer riding, but the stability you get is just really impressive. It definitely adds. Oh, bud. Oh, hang on a second. Hang on. Oh, not mine too. You good? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, yeah. I mean, it's just more to manage, right? I mean, there's no upside without a downside elsewhere. And you know, if you're riding Squamish on purpose-built trails, then being 5'11", oh. Good? Yeah, go ahead. All right. Then, you know, being 5'11" on this big size would probably work fine. But if you're here, probably going with the smaller option is the ticket. Oh, yeah, see that front end, man. You just kind of are forced to really put your chest on the bar and get the back end to slide. But the flip, oh gosh, that could have been bad. You do not want to send that long end. Switchback. Of course, you know, the upside is, oh, woo, switchback. You've got a lot of confidence and inspiration to really let that front end just roll out ahead of you and eat up the hits more than most bikes of this category, travel category, would want to do. One thing I will say about this bike, even though it is a high pivot, which don't always get off the ground all that well, this bike is surprisingly lively and poppy. So like even tiny little lips or tree hopping stuff is a treat. Like, it doesn't stick to the ground or, you know, suck up big lip or little lips, I should say, the way some bikes do. It does a really good job of remaining playful and lively, and I like that a lot. Woo! So obviously you rode along on the trails and got my feedback in real time. Of course, that's just one ride over many that we've had over the last, I don't know, 5 months that we've had the bike, and passed it around to some of our crew. So what are the final thoughts, the takeaways, and how have we answered the people that ask, should I replace? Is this better? How does it compare? So something that I really try to say and tell people a lot is, you're never gonna get a gain without a drawback somewhere else. And what the gain in suspension performance for downhill capabilities of this bike, it does come at a little bit of a loss for the climbing. It's actually not as much as I thought it would be. However, there is a little bit of a difference. Of course, climbing traction was greatly improved. Climbing comfort was improved. It's a much more supple and smooth platform. Noise wasn't terrible. You definitely want to stay on the chain maintenance a little bit more. But as far as feeling the drag or hearing it, it was not that big of a deal at all. Moving into the suspension side of things, traction is increased again, not only climbing but descending. Braking performance is better. The rear end doesn't get nearly as stiff when you're under brakes. This also means better cornering traction and just generally a more confident and capable descending bike. This is like, if I had to like try to describe it, it's not like a beefed up long-legged trail bike. It's more like a big burly enduro bike that got shortened into light duty mode. But just the way that the suspension behaves, the composure of the bike, it just kind of gives you more confidence than you would expect. It's a very fun bike to ride. It's a bike I really like. The sizing thing for me is a bit of an issue though. I'm 5'11". Most of the other guys that have ridden the bike are, 6 foot, 6'2". Everyone's got different proportions. Some are more leggy, some have got, really long torsos, but, everyone agreed the bike felt long. And I think probably the best explanation, or I should say the best showcase I have for this was the very first time I rode this bike. I didn't look at the numbers, even though they're printed on this really cool sticker on the top too. I did not look at the reach. We do our best to not look at stuff before we test ride bikes. And I dropped into trails I'd never ridden up in Washington State, and they were steep. You would drop in, and at the very bottom of this chute would be a hard right-hand corner, and it was basically just like a fall line with just like sharp corners where you're braking pretty heavily and trying to hold on. So after you got out of that section, the trail flattened out, and it was, maybe 12 inches wide, kind of side hill and very green, like just rich Washington, right? Wet rainforest foliage. So, you come out of this chute at speed and the trail just is a blind, bluff, and you're just curving around it. And I felt like my feet and pedals were dragging, and the back wheel was dragging on the inside of this corner, and the front wheel was hanging off the edge of the mountain, right? Like I was just like, oh my gosh, this just doesn't feel right. And when I was going into those steep chutes into the turns, I'm like looking at my legs and my feet and my butt, and I'm like, okay, I'm weighting myself over the bottom bracket where I feel at home, right? Like when you get into that position and you can see the bottom bracket, you're like, okay, I'm here or I'm there or I'm over the front. Like I felt like this is my power position over the bottom bracket where I should be, but why do I feel like I'm riding like this? And that was when I was pushing back up and I looked at the reach number and I saw that 497.5, and I was like, oh, that makes sense, because I like 480 to 485 on non-E mountain bikes. And this is over 10 millimeters longer than that. And that is a noticeable difference. And when it came time to just reacting and riding on blind trails that are pretty technical, hard, and demanding, I felt a difference. And I feel like the size 3 at 472 is about 10 millimeters, 8-ish millimeters shorter than ideal. So I would probably go for that size, but again, I think it's just kind of indicative of this day and age where brands are building bikes and designing bikes based on the trends they're seeing, the feedback they're getting from dealers and consumers. And of course, I think a big part of that is where the brand is located and the trails that they regularly ride. So obviously British Columbia, Squamish, North Shore, Vancouver, all these areas have got very different trails than you find in the backcountry mountains of Oregon and Washington that are 100-year-old, hiking, logging, mining trails that have really tight switchbacks and, maybe are exactly what you ride or something you never encounter on your big, wide open, modern, new school trails. I'm kind of going into the weeds on geo, but I think it's important because no matter how good a suspension platform is, how good a deal it is, how cool it looks, anything else, if the bike doesn't fit you and your riding terrain well, then there's always going to be a little bit of a compromise or a less than ideal situations that you'll encounter on your bike. And I think you need to just, weigh the pros and cons of that for where you ride and how it works. All that aside, comparing this Sight to the last gen Sight, I would rather have this bike. I like the suspension compliance. I like that it is a bit softer. It offers more traction. I like that it allows me to ride a bit more aggressively and harder. And for me, being more of a downhill focused rider, I'm willing to sacrifice that little bit of uphill performance loss in terms of efficiency. It's still surprisingly lively and playful, like airing it out over little stuff, does a really good job. My only real complaint really is that I just kind of at 5'11" fit in the little bit of a gray zone for sizing, and I just don't know which way to go. Other than that though, a pretty solid bike. So yeah, in conclusion, I don't love the Deity bars. I've always found them to be really harsh and abusive. And kind of distracts from the ride a little bit. The Exo Plus tires could be argued for and against. I did have to run a couple extra PSI more than I would have liked to have run, just to err on the side of safety, especially in some of the big backcountry rides that we did where there was a lot of rocks and maybe down trees. But, of course, the flip side of that is weight, right? And ride quality and trail feel. But yeah, maybe a double down rear would be nice and keep that Exo Plus up front. But overall, a great bike. I think downhill bias riders, people that want traction and compliance and support, they want to push and charge hard while they're out on their trail rides, but maybe don't need big travel. This is a great bike worth considering. If you're the XC focused Norco Sight rider of last year, you might want to hold on to that thing, or maybe check out the Optic, because it'll be a little bit more sprightly and I guess efficient for you pedal minded folks. So thank you guys for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave any questions or comments you have down below, and we'll see you guys out on the trails.